Alright, PLC team, we are ready to take a look at that rubric that we've been looking at and talking about the C3 framework, how that fits into our social studies lessons. And so we've each taught them the segregation lesson. We plan now to take a look at kind of evaluating that lesson, how our students did, our teaching on it, to see where we need to move students forward in the next steps. So when I take a look at the framework rubric here, the very first part of it says the unit has tight alignment to the C3 framework and to the Common Core standards in our areas. So when we actually planned this unit, we really were mindful then of looking at the C3 framework and each of the dimensions. And so that piece of having then our compelling questions, our supporting questions, and then having the kids really look at those throughout the unit. We've done that part so far, so I feel like we have that dimension in there. The dimension 2, with putting all the areas of social studies, we've got the civics in it. This lesson especially focuses on the economic piece of it. We have some other lessons that focus on the geography piece. And then also the entire unit is really a history-based unit, so I think we have all that in there. Dimension 3 is then really is a focus of this lesson too, because we're going to have the kids analyze. We're going to analyze some sources that went with segregation, and use the evidence and really talk about that with collaborative their groups of what that was going to look like. So we have that, and then I think Dimension 4, that communicating and conclusions, which we did through the kids sharing out of their images, really telling their thinking on that. And we can get more into that as we look at other parts of the rubric, but I really think that we have each part of the 4 dimensions on there. As far as the Common Core literacy standards, what are you guys thinking about that?
Well, I know compare and contrast is a standard that we're really focusing on right now, and I think the students do that through slavery segregation, the different photos we're comparing and contrasting, the different texts that we have given them. So I think that's a major focus that we've had so far.
Yeah, I do too.
I think the other one would be the close reading strategy that we've been working on, and looking at all the different passages that we've read and looking at some of the images, and really that idea of reading it closely and going back to the text multiple times.
Yeah, the evidence piece of it, of really trying to get the kids to say that it's not just, you know, I think this, but I know this because, and this is how I can prove that. I know, and I one thing that I really think that my students have done well with this is really starting to look at that source too, and keep referring back to that. So
to the image.
Yeah, which before this, I don't think that they've done that really well. But I think practice, you know, helps us with that too. All right, so if we take a look then at the key shifts in the C3 framework and the Common Core, we've got quite a few shifts on there. What are you guys thinking about that?
I feel like we addressed the shifts when we did our planning of the unit. We looked at all the dimensions of the C3 framework, and we really embedded our literacy standards in the lessons as we were planning. So I think we did a really good job addressing
good questions.
Right. I agree that the questioning piece of it's in there with our compelling, our supporting. We've got the collaborative piece in there. You know, our literacy practices, we've really focused on those through a lot of our PLC time.
Yeah.
You know, the text complexities, just having our different sources with the read naturally ones, some of those read work things, plus all of the literature books that we read aloud to the kids. I really feel like a lot of those are focused on. And, you know, just with our writing from sources, too, the whole summative project that we have planned for them to actually create their own nonfiction text about slavery through segregation really fits on that. That's more of a summative, but we are checking that along the way, too.
And they put that academic vocabulary into their books as they write.
Exactly. So really focus on those text features when they do that. That academic vocabulary goes in that, too. So.
I even think that academic vocabulary translates into other areas, because I'll hear my kids talk about that during our class meetings or during our morning meetings, or they're bringing that and kind of connecting to their own lives, too.
Right, exactly. So then if we look at like the instructional supports within the next area of the rubric is that, which I really feel like this whole unit is so amazing to them, because they don't really realize that this happened in history, that there was such a thing as slavery, that there was such a thing as segregation.
And that it wasn't as long ago as they think it was.
Exactly, and how long it actually lasted. I think that interest and engagement keeps them hooked to the entire unit.
And with all the literature, the wonderful books that there are.
And they just don't even want you to stop
Yeah.
reading.
Right.
You
And they
know?
just instantly, naturally internalize everything.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And so when we look at those, I think all the instructional supports are there.
I think this unit is such a good one. Well, and especially this lesson that we're looking at, the photos, is such a good one for differentiation because our students that maybe aren't our highest readers can take part and be just as much of a participant as your higher readers. As they're looking at the images, they focus into the pictures as struggling readers usually do, and there's little amount of text, they just have to look at the sourcing. So they have as much opportunity to be successful at it as your higher learners as well.
I agree with that completely. The other thing that I think stands out in this one is one of them is technology. And although we don't always let them go look for things online with this unit, because there is some things that you kind of have to be careful with, third graders that we don't necessarily want them to see and know all about everything that happened
the
with
way
the
they were
violence,
treated.
how immense that really was. I mean, if they understand that there were sit-ins and that there was violent things, I don't think we need to necessarily show them all the pieces that go with that.
Right.
But I do think that this lesson that we did leads to that technology piece that we're, making that digital timeline next in Computer Lab, that these images can then go on that timeline, and it really makes that visual representation when they're creating that timeline make more sense too.
We've been really planful too with our technology person for her to help us with sites that are good and instructionally sound for our students and safe, that we know that they can go there. And
Right. So I think that instructional supports, we've looked at not just, even media specialists, we've looked at our, computer lab specialists, as you just mentioned. We've really planned together. So I think that we have done a nice job of really thinking through some of that stuff too. So if we go to the very last piece of it, I think that will get us into more of the part of talking about the lesson that we actually did in that, because it's assessment. And so in that we know we have a summative assessment with the end in mind of looking at the kids are creating this, nonfiction book. We also look at formatively along the way and use that rubric of thinking of where the kids are at as far as when they analyze an image, where they fall on that. And so taking a look then at our student work in here, what are some of the things that stood out to you guys about how do you think that they did in this lesson, as far as analyzing the images and stuff like that from segregation?
For mine, I realized we've talked about segregation, we talked about what prejudice meant, but we hadn't really gone into the different types of oppression, different types of segregation. So that's where, after I've done this, looking through this, that's our next step, is to talk about where were the African Americans oppressed and what types of segregation occurred. Because they know there's segregation and they know that's separation of blacks and whites, but they are not exactly knowledgeable about what types of segregation there were. That was for my group.
one of the things that I noticed in my group was they did a nice job of looking at the sourcing, which I didn't push too much because I wanted to see who would naturally go there and who didn't. And I would say probably 90% of my kids did a great job with being able to find where the image, what the dates, where the images were. But then I still have quite the range of the ability levels to really analyze photos, whereas I've had one group, the exact same photo, really the lunch ladies refusing to serve the black men, whereas the same picture in another group, the black men were sitting down and eating at a counter. So I really still have that range of understanding.
So some of those books that we put into it should help clarify some of
Yes,
those
yes, because
misconceptions.
we haven't read books like The Sit-In and all that yet. So
My kids, from looking at their questions, I can really tell that they are starting to understand what segregation was, but their questions are showing me that they're ready to understand. So how did they overcome the oppression and move in? They're ready to know about some of the civil rights stuff because they're asking, was Martin Luther there? And we haven't talked a lot about him, but they have that background knowledge and they're ready to find out. So how did
he say
how do we
this
fix
end?
it?
Yeah, and that's what I can tell from their questions, that they are ready for that next
That's
question.
exactly what I noticed in mine too. One of the students asked me, he said, all right, we figured out how slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, but now we've learned that there's all these different oppressions that happened after the Civil War. How did those stop?
Right.
What caused this to end? And, who was the president who did that? So the kids really, I think, are ready to move on piece of it too.
Good point.
Of
Right.
really looking at, so now they understand just by answering that first supporting question and second supporting question of what was slavery and how that ended, and how is our country divided, and they kind of know now how that piece ended, but they really want to figure out now, just introducing this to them with that vocabulary, because I feel like that academic vocabulary of sharecropping and segregation, voting rights, those are things that the kids, and prejudice, right, that our kids, and even oppression, they didn't understand what those were before starting this unit.
Yeah, and now they want to know how did they get from there to where we are today,
Yes.
Right.
and where we're all together. Who
So
helped that?
I think this was actually a good formative assessment for segregation, just because it gives us then a snippet of what they really do understand and where their misconceptions are at to lead us into what read-alouds do we need to do next. And I think we have those sources already available to us. We've got some of those ready to roll.
Yes.
So I feel like our next steps is to do some more of the read-alouds, start moving into some of the other types of oppression, and as you said, Nikki, other types of segregation that there were, and maybe even leading into what you said, Caitlin, of then how did people fit into this? Because I don't also, like you said, they know Martin Luther King Jr., but I don't want them to think that Martin Luther
He
King
was the one that fixed it all.
Yes,
Right.
exactly. That's just what I was
And there's so
thinking,
many
too.
no names that are important. That's why these books would be great, because it's not people that they've always heard of.
Exactly.
We have our Ruby Bridges, our Rosa Parks, but there's also all these other people that weren't famous, but they're the ones that took a stand.
Right. And then maybe we can get kids, I think that dimension 4 is sometimes hard to get to in the C3 framework. But if we do that, like you were talking about earlier, Shannon, I wonder through our class meetings if we can even get kids to understand then, or really take a look at, I could be this person.
Right.
I can make
That's
a
what I
difference.
was wondering too. Is like, and even like if you were living during this time, what would you do? You're not Martin Luther King Jr., but what would you do?
Could you have been
Yeah.
that
Could you
brave?
have-
Would you have been that brave? Yep.
Yeah.
It's easy to say it,
Or
but to actually do
even,
it.
the prejudice that we even have within our classrooms now, just the economic base. We have the haves and the have-nots. Having kids realize that everybody inside can be a nice person. It doesn't matter what they wear on the outside. It's just some of those things I think that we can really bring out. And think before you speak next week, I think that this
Tie right
talk
in.
can tie right into that too.
I agree.
All right, so anything else that you feel like next steps should be? I think we have a pretty good grasp of where we should need to go
I think
next.
so too.
All right, so we'll start looking at some of those lessons then and planning those and getting ready to roll those out then next.
Perfect.
Sounds great.
Okay.